charged with aggravated assault and battery after shooting at children who were playing hide and seek behind his house. He struck a 14-year-old girl in the back of the head. She was not killed, but you know, she's in the hospital. David Doyle, 58, told detectives that he got his gun when he saw shadows outside his home and shot at people he saw running away, unknowingly hitting the girl. Right. So this is one type of shooting in America. It's not quite a mass shooting. I mean, you know, if this girl who got hit was with several other kids who were playing hide and seek in the woods behind his house, and had 4 of them got shot, this would be, and killed, this would have been considered a mass shooting. But this isn't the kind of mass shooting that I want to talk about today. The kind of mass shootings I want to talk about today are, in my opinion, and I mentioned this briefly yesterday as I was thinking about this, and you know, it's like in other countries, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Israel, they have these problems with suicide bombers. You know, 99% of the time, Muslim extremists. And, you know, they go in and, you know, these are people who are willing to commit suicide. In fact, in many cases, enthusiastic about committing suicide. And their goal is to take out as many people as possible. Can you imagine if we had Islamic suicide bombers, radical Muslim suicide bombers here in the United States? And they, you know, yesterday they blew up 8 people. The day before they blew up 5 people. The day before that they blew up 20 people. You know, can you imagine how the Republicans would respond to this? If brown-skinned Muslims from the Middle East were blowing up people in the United States, or people whose ancestry was there, strapping on suicide vests. Trump and the Republican Party would be full-on hysterical. They'd be beside themselves with rage. They'd be foaming at the mouth. They'd stop calling to defund the FBI and start calling to increase its budget. They'd support money for suicide prevention programs that could prevent people from becoming suicide bombers. They'd do whatever they could to outlaw suicide vests and plastic explosives that could be used that way. Well, I think we're there. I think we have a suicide shooter problem in the United States. For example, the guy with the right-wing death squad, the Proud Boys patch on his, stitched onto his bulletproof vest yesterday, or Saturday, who went hunting people in Allen, Texas, killed 3 children, 8 people. This guy knew he was going to die before he walked out the door. He was there to commit suicide and take as many people with him as he could, which is exactly what the radical Islamic bombers do, the suicide bombers. They strap on their suicide vests, willing to die, sometimes claiming it's for a greater cause, and sometimes just because they want to commit suicide. And this is a way that's socially acceptable, that they imagine will get support from their friends and neighbors. And frankly, I think we see the same thing with America's suicide shooters. They have support groups, just like the Islamic suicide bombers do. Most of them are located online. Sometimes they're in their own lives. They see themselves as heroes, turning, you know, basically a boring suicide into a media event. They have easy access to the means for their suicide that simultaneously kills many others. That's obviously, you know, these weapons of war. Gillian Peterson and James Densley are criminologists. Peterson is a psychologist, Densley is a sociologist, and both of them professors. And they have spent 2 years with a giant grant from the from the U.S. Department of Justice via the National Institute for Justice, studying, well, this is what they say. We built a database dating back to 1966 of every mass shooter who shot and killed 4 or more people in a public place, and every shooting incident at schools, workplaces, and places of worship since 1999. We've interviewed incarcerated perpetrators and their families, shooting survivors, first responders. We've read media and social media, manifestos, suicide notes, trial transcripts, and medical records. And what did they conclude? Now, they start out talking about school shooters, so this is specific to school shooters. They said, quote, our analysis found that about 80% of mass school shooters were suicidal. Almost all of them died at the scene of the shooting, often by their own hand. Our analysis shows that 52% of mass school shooters kill themselves, while 15% are killed by police and only 30% are apprehended. Suicide shooters. Scott Bond is also a criminologist. He wrote a piece for Psychology Today talking about this issue, and he said, quote, absent from public discussion is the fact that the steady rise in suicide in America is contrasted by a steady decline in homicide. These unusual and conflicting patterns have coexisted for a number of years. Incredibly, there are now more than 3 suicides for every murder committed in the United States. He says, and then he goes on to say that, and I quote, the only category of homicide that has been increasing over the last 10 years is mass murders, specifically mass public shootings. Mass murder is, again, I'm quoting this criminologist and PhD, mass murder is frequently a form of suicide in which the perpetrator of such atrocities is often an enraged and fatalistic individual who intends to die at the scene of the massacre. In fact, more than 50% of mass shooters die at their crime scene. From this perspective, the increase in mass public shootings over the last 10 years is very consistent with the increase in suicide. This is something called the social contagion effect. We know that this applies to suicide. When one, in a public school, one kid commits suicide, within a year, the risk of another kid committing suicide is exponentially higher than it was prior to that first kid committing suicide. It appears to be the same thing with mass shootings, that there's a social contagion effect on this. And as long as we continue to treat them as, oh, well, this guy in Texas, he's a member of the right-wing death squad, and look at that, he took out 8 people. Rather than treating them as suicides. This guy went to commit suicide and in the process killed 8 people. Those are completely different frames. For the suicide shooters, they all want us to use the frame of, oh, he's a noble warrior in the fight of white supremacy. They realize most people don't like white supremacy, but their friends do. Their little support group online does. This guy was, the Allen, Texas shooter was posting on a Russian website for white supremacists in America. And, he found his peeps, he found his community, he found his support. And so he went out there and died a noble death, a martyr to the cause. And right-wingers, if they love nothing else, they love martyrs. I mean, just go back all the way back to Horst Wessel. Horst Wessel was the Horst Wessel song, Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. It's illegal to sing that in Germany. I learned that when I lived there. This was, Horst Wessel was a 30-year-old SA soldier who was shot in the head and killed by a communist in 1930, and he became the hero of the Nazi movement, the martyr, right up until the day Hitler committed suicide in 1945. 15 years. And this is what these suicide shooters are aiming for. Whether they're people who are trying to own the libs like Anders Breivik, or kill blacks like in the Buffalo supermarket, or Dylan Roof, or Jews like in the Tree of Life synagogue, all while making a political statement. I mean, there are message boards that lionize these people, that literally list their names as a wall of heroes. Not a wall of shame, a wall of heroes. So how do you de-heroize people? You say, oh, he's just committing suicide and he wants to take as many people with him when he dies. And isn't that pathetic? Now, I realize that there's a certain risk identifying them as suicides because social contagion, includes suicides as well as mass shooters. But it may cause some of these people to realize, what they're doing and seek out suicide prevention help, which is well established in the United States. We have suicide hotlines all over the country. They're easy to find. We'll see. I mean, what say you? What do you think about this? My thought on it is that by reframing these, that first of all, we should separate suicide shooters from mass shooters who are not suicide shooters. And there's a few of those. They typically are people who have a grievance against a spouse or against an employer or somebody in their place of work. Those kind of shooters are not suicide shooters, or at least not the kind of suicide shooters I'm describing. I'm describing right-wing suicide terrorist shooters. And, you know, perhaps we should attach the word terrorist to them as well. In fact, I think that's probably a very good idea. I wish I'd thought of it yesterday when I was writing this piece. But at the very least, I think that we need to start, you know, ripping away the patina of martyrdom and the rationalization of a just cause and just expose them as the run-of-the-mill suicides that they really are.